Set up. Jazakumullah khairan for your patience. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulih al-Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. All praise due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We praise Him and we thank Him for giving us this opportunity to be able to, inshallah, learn from each other and hopefully be inspired with some words that I have to share with us. And, mashallah, Brother Misbah actually shared something that is, definitely very close to my heart, because it's one of those creative ways of sharing what I'm about to share today. Of course, a different aspect of it and different time frame you're talking about, but reviving that aspect of history that is often neglected in a very creative way. So, one of the things that I'd like to start off with is, I guess, an ayah in Surah Al-Hujurat. Surah Al-Hujurat is a surah of the Quran that actually is the basis for all forms of social dealings that Allah teaches us how to live our lives by. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha. He's talking to not just believers, He's talking to you and I and the humanity at large, and He's saying, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha. We have created you from a male and a female. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. That we have created you among you, basically, or from you, created or divided you among shu'ub wa qaba'il, meaning essentially nations and tribes. For what? To do what? لِتَعَارَفُوا, right? So not to fight, not to call each other names, not to think of anybody higher or lower than you. Instead, to لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that you may know each other. And inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. After that, Allah is saying that the best, the one that is most noble among you, the one who has the highest status in Allah's sight, is the one with taqwa, this quality that is, of course, nobody could measure. This is the most interesting part about it. So the reason I want to start off with this ayah is, we all love this ayah, I'm sure, and we all like to live by this ideal ayah, this ideal that Allah has taught us. But the question is, how many of us truly live this ideal of Islam? When it comes to the history of Africa, and Islam in Africa in particular, and Muslims in Africa, this is one of the most neglected parts of Islamic history that unfortunately, that we all are, unfortunately part of, that we are all not victims of, but actually even perpetrators of in some ways. Meaning that we have not, unfortunately, given it the due importance that it deserves. So what I'd like to do for the first good, 15-20 minutes, inshallah, is highlight the reasons why it is so critical for us to study the Islamic history of Africa. And if I may request somebody here to just simply sort of click as I speak, that would be really appreciated. So before I get into this, may I ask you guys, I know I'll be interacting right now with brothers, but I'm sure sisters are hearing as well, inshallah. Why study history of Islam in Africa? Why? Before I list any of these, why? Why is it so critical for us? What are some of the reasons you can think of that is so important for us as Muslims to study of not a history of Islam in Africa, but history of Islam in Africa that has contributed to Islam in general, starting from the time of Prophet ﷺ till this day? Why? Any reasons? Any reasons? Think of any reason that has any connection to Islam and Africa you could ever think of. Bilal radiallahu ta'ala. Yes.
Islam was there for 800 years.
Actually, more than that, of course. That's correct. Yes. What else? Excellent. That's the kind of response I'm looking for. And Bilal radiallahu ta'ala. And first migration of Islam was to Abyssinia. So we'll get into that actually. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on that because I really want to establish that. What else? Any other reasons you can think of? Yeah? Jamiat al-Azhar. Excellent. Looks like somebody has just read my presentation right here, the first page. What else? What other reasons? Sorry? Timbuktu. Timbuktu, the famous city, the forgotten city of Islam, Islamic civilization. What else? Any other reasons? Tariq bin Ziyad, okay. Yeah, I mean, they went through Africa, okay, sure, to Spain. Salahuddin, okay, that's excellent, that's very good, because he came from Africa, from Algeria, and what is interesting, or Morocco, what people don't realize is that when we think of Africa and African Islam, we only sometimes think of people who are of, who are necessarily, as we call them, blacks today. So it's not just blacks, it's Arab nations, it's the Berbers over there, and of course the indigenous black Africans who were part of Africa. So excellent reasons, jazakumullah khairan. So we'll go over this very quickly. So the first reason is some of the closest companions of the Prophet ﷺ were of African descent. Some of the closest, and we'll talk about it, why they're so closest, inshallah, in just a moment. Another reason, somebody already mentioned, the first caller to, not Islam, sorry, I actually had to update that. The first caller to Salah, the prayer, was an African Muslim, who was Bilal bin Rabah radiallahu ta'ala. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Another reason is that the first haven, as somebody already mentioned, the first place of refuge for Muslims was Africa, not Arabia. Islam came to Arabia, but the continent, the country, the place that gave refuge to believers was Africa. Another reason is some of the earliest universities in the world and in Islamic world of Islamic civilization were actually are still in Africa and still there. Subhanallah. And some of those, one of them is Azhar, another one Faiz. There's a whole bunch of others that Qarawiyun. There's a whole bunch of others that are out there actually. And then Timbuktu, of course. We'll talk about that today, inshallah. And African Islam is an incredibly rich, scholastic, has a very rich scholastic, scholarly, and literary tradition, which is something that we don't realize. Today, what are the images of Africa that we know of? What do you think of Africa? Slavery. What else? Poverty. What other images do we see of Africa? Fighting, war, violence, disease. Exactly. This is sad reality, and it's absolutely blown up. This is the problem. When the Ebola virus broke out, yes, it was a big deal. Yes, we had to make sure for public safety and health concerns, you have to take measures. But it's one or two countries where it was essentially limited. Yes, it was spreading. But if you were sitting here in North America, what did you think? Anything with Africa, basically anybody from Africa literally was carrying their virus and probably bringing it to us in America, in Canada or North America, right? So this is something for us to think about, that these are the kinds of images that we need to shatter. Another reason is African Muslims account for 1/4 of world's Muslim population. We don't realize that. A quarter of us, ideally, one in every poor person in this room should be an African. This is subhanallah amazing. And yet we are not integrated enough to have such people with us. African American Muslims, think about this. African American Muslims, let's put it this way. African American Muslims make up of 1/3 of Islam in America. In the US, this is the reality. 1/3 of Islam in America, in the US, is actually African American. A sister, an African Somali sister I was just speaking to, who's very involved with the Somali community, was basically saying that a quarter of Toronto Islam is what? Somali. A quarter. There are over 100,000 Somali Muslims right here, and mostly in the East End or somewhere in the Toronto area. Subhanallah. A quarter of Toronto Muslims is actually Somalis. And yet, we need to ask ourselves how integrated we are and how connected we are with such communities. And the last very critical reason, as I already mentioned, I'm just going to emphasize, and this is, if anything, this is one thing we'll take from today's presentation, is that we need to shatter these images of poverty, of incivility, barbarism that we have sometimes in our own minds about Africa and African Islam and African Muslims. We have to kill those images and really rethink how we think about Africa, and African Islam, and African Canadian Islam, and African American Islam, inshallah. So these are some very critical reasons why we need to study Africa and African Islam and Muslims in Africa. So the first thing I want to focus on is I want to start off with the time of Prophet ﷺ himself. And there are three things I want to mention. I want to start off with this great Sahabi, or Sahabiya in fact, in this case, a companion of the Prophet ﷺ. Her name was Barakah, who was also known as Ayman. Who was this person? What was so special about her? Anybody knows? What's so significant about this lady?
She was the mother of Osama.
Okay, very good. But I'm looking for another connection. Yes.
She was with the Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and Hazrat Amna, and when she passed away, she took care of.
Excellent. So basically, she is the only companion, male or female, in the history of Islam who had the honor of living and witnessing long enough to witness the birth of the Prophet ﷺ as well as the death. No Sahabi had this honor. No companion, the greatest of the greatest Sahaba. Not one Sahabi actually had this honor the way this lady radiallahu ta'ala anha, Barakah, who was later known as Ayman radiallahu ta'ala anha, had. Incredible. So this Sahabiya, who was little teenage African Abyssinian young girl, who was a servant of Amina, the mother of the Prophet ﷺ, was there with the mother of the Prophet ﷺ when he was born. When she was pregnant and her husband had gone and he had passed away, Abdullah had passed away, and she was in so much anxiety and stress as you could imagine, giving birth to the first and only child, in absence of her father and husband, basically. And when she basically went to Medina or Yathrib at the time to visit her husband's grave, this young girl, Barakah, was there with Amina. And Amina passes away basically at that moment. And guess who was there to bring the Prophet ﷺ back to Mecca? It was Barakah radiallahu ta'ala anha. So just imagine, she was literally his second mother, if not the mother essentially, in reality. And Prophet ﷺ would every time he saw Ayman, he would get up and honor her and call her Ummi, my mother. He had a very special bond with her. She was there, every household the Prophet ﷺ was brought up in after that. She was there with Abdul Muttalib, his grandfather, who took care of him after. She was there with Abu Talib, taking care of the Prophet ﷺ. She was there even at the time of Khadija radiallahu ta'ala, taking care of the Prophet ﷺ and their needs basically in the family. And then one day in Mecca there was a special house because they were not able to worship openly. So there was a special house where they would meet at the house of somebody known as Al-Arqam radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So it's called Darul Arqam, a small place probably just like, a spacious but small space, cozy place just like this perhaps, where the Prophet ﷺ would meet and Sahaba would be there and they would be talking about their mission and the prophethood and whatnot. And one day Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha sends a message to the Prophet ﷺ through Ayman now. Okay, so now she's the older lady, and she says, go and give this message to the Prophet ﷺ. She goes and knocks the door, gives the message to the Prophet ﷺ. As she leaves, the Prophet ﷺ said, who would like to marry this woman of paradise? Think about this, subhanAllah. How many people had this honor? Very few, where the Prophet ﷺ in his own life would point to somebody and said, this is a person from paradise, from Jannah. Who would like to marry this lady of paradise? And the Prophet ﷺ, and here is Zayd radiallahu ta'ala who raises his hand, Zayd bin Harith radiallahu ta'ala who raises his hand, he said, I will, Ya Rasulullah. He gets married to Ayman radiallahu ta'ala anha, and through them came an incredible Sahabi that Brother Asad already just mentioned. Incredible young, teenage, bright young Sahabi, and his name was Usama bin Zayd. And think about this, how critical his role was. He is the Sahabi whom the Prophet ﷺ chose above Abu Bakr, Umar, everybody else at the time of his death to be sent on an expedition as he was passing away. Now, you have Prophet ﷺ passing away and on his deathbed, and you have Ayman again there taking care of the Prophet ﷺ. Just to highlight how close she was to the Prophet and the message of the Quran and the message of the Prophet ﷺ. You know, few days after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhuma were passing by, walking together, and they passed by a house and they heard some lady crying profusely. They go to this house and they found Ayman radiallahu ta'ala anha was crying profusely. And they asked her, and they were shocked to hear the answer. They asked her, why are you crying, Ayman? And she said something that they did not expect. They thought if there was anybody who had the right to love the Prophet ﷺ the most would be Ayman, because she was literally like mother, who was there from the beginning till the end. But subhanAllah, think about this answer. She said, I'm crying because the revelation has stopped. SubhanAllah, think about that. The incredible deep connection that she had with the Quran and with the revelation and the wahi of the Prophet ﷺ. So not only was she missing the Prophet ﷺ, she was actually missing that communication, direct communication from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when Abu Bakr and Umar heard this, they began to cry, they couldn't stop, and they wept profusely themselves. This is one of the first closest connections of the Prophet ﷺ, whom Allah chose to be from a person who was of African descent. This is something we hardly hear about. Usama bin Zayd was an black African young teenage boy whom the Prophet ﷺ chose at the time of his death to lead an expedition. Think about that. So that is the first, this is the first connection that I wanted to share with you. The second connection is, somebody already mentioned, is of course of Bilal bin Rabah radiallahu ta'ala anhu. He was the first mu'adhin of Islam. You know, this is amazing. I'm sure some of you are already aware of this story. This man, subhanAllah, there's so many amazing stories about him, but I'll share a couple of very quick ones, just to again show how close and how incredible this Sahabi was. He was tortured. He was one of the first to accept Islam. Some say 7th, some say, definitely one among the top 10 Sahaba who accepted Islam, who was enslaved in Africa, in Arabia. And as soon as he heard about Islam, he accepted it wholeheartedly, because this was the source of freedom for them. And he was tortured so much that there's something very famous about him that he used to utter when he was tortured. Anybody knows what he used to say? Ahadun, ahad, ahadun, ahad. He would just keep saying this. This was the state of his belief. It does not matter. One of his other Sahabi at the time said, you have rukhsa. You have, basically, you can just pretend. When you're being tortured, just pretend, that you're not a Muslim. Just say it. It's not a big deal. But they're telling you to just say, revoke, La ilaha illallah. Don't say it. Just get out of it. Why all this trouble? And he famously said, you can imprison my body, but you cannot imprison my soul. SubhanAllah. You can imprison my body, you can trap my body, do whatever you want, but you cannot do that with my soul, because my soul is free and is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was a Sahabi when the Prophet ﷺ was brainstorming how to call people to the salah, and he was getting ideas. Some people said, why don't we use horn, Some people said, why don't you use bells like Christians? Others said, maybe like Persians, you can light a fire. Here comes Jabir bin Abdullah radiallahu ta'ala anhu, who said, I saw this dream last night, and this is what I heard in my dream, and how about we use this to call people to Allah, to adhan, to salah. And he narrated, Allahu Akbar, he narrates all that. And the Prophet ﷺ was excited. He said, this is exactly what we should use. And then comes Umar radiallahu ta'ala, who literally dragging his lower garment. He said, Ya Rasulullah, I saw the same dream last night. And he just simply confirmed what somebody else saw. And the Prophet ﷺ said, yes, let's go for it. And then out of all the people, whom does the Prophet ﷺ choose to do adhan? An African young man whose sacrifices were unparalleled, whose voice was one of the most strongest and loudest and most beautiful out there. He chose Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu ta'ala anhu among all the qualified Arabic speaking, great, people with great accents, Arabic accent and everything. Despite the fact that Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu ta'ala anhu had a bit of a speech impediment himself. He could not say sheen very clearly. So just imagine, he would often say ashadu instead of ashhadu. Despite that, the Prophet ﷺ chose this man to stand on the highest and the highest status in this world and call people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and five times a day. And he was the mu'adhin of the Prophet till the time of the death of the Prophet ﷺ. So for years, he was the Sahabi, and sometimes he would have an assistant Sahabi, mu'adhin, and that would be Abdullah ibn Maktoum radiallahu ta'ala, who was also who was a Sahabi who was happy to be blind. So this is amazing that he chose Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu ta'ala. I want to end the story of Bilal with something that is really critical to show his love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You know, after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he just simply could not do adhan. Does anybody know why? Exactly. So he would start and he would say, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammad, and then he would just not be able to complete. He just simply refused, and he would not do adhan anymore. He would start crying and he would not be able to continue. So one day, a few years had passed. He moved. So by the way, he moved out of Medina because he was so saddened by the death of the Prophet ﷺ. He refused to do adhan, and he didn't want to live in Medina because he missed the Prophet ﷺ so much. And he moved to Sham. And when there was a victory, Muslims got there, and the Prophet ﷺ, Sahaba said, Arihna ya Bilal, just like the Prophet ﷺ used to call him, Arihna ya Bilal. Bring joy to our hearts, ya Bilal. And they convinced him, just do it. Just do it one more time for us. He goes up, he starts, Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, and he would not continue. And he stopped, he was not able to do it. This is years later. This is a type of love that is very hard for us to imagine. Just imagine somebody whom truly loves so much, that reminds you so much, that you would not be able to bear it. This was the love of this man. No wonder that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose him over everybody else. And years later, around few years around that time, Hassan and Hussein, the grandsons of the Prophet ﷺ, it is narrated, they went to Sham and they convinced Bilal to come back to Medina. Come back and do the adhan for us. And they go and they convince him, he comes back, he does the adhan, and then you know what? He was again so depressed. He remembered the Prophet so much that he left Medina. On his way back, he passed away. And it is said that he passed away because of this deep sorrow that he had, that he just simply could not get over it. Subhanallah. Unbelievable. This was one of the greatest Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ, who happened to be African, which we do not appreciate at times. Subhanallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us one of those whom Allah chooses us. And let me mention this. This is something that, let me mention one more thing, which I forgot to mention. It was there on the slide. It just simply is so overwhelming when I heard this. Anybody been to South Africa or Malaysia or some of these other countries? Yes. Does anybody know the title people use to call somebody for a mu'adhin? Today we call a person who does adhan, we call him mu'adhin. You know what they call him there? They call him Bilal. Think about this. Unbelievable status. Nobody in the world, no other Sahabi even got this status. Call that Bilal. Call that Bilal. Not mu'adhin, but call that Bilal. Subhanallah. What an honor. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us that honor one day, inshallah. So the next thing is, I'm still in the time of Prophet ﷺ because I really, really want to hammer this in. Now, think about this, brothers and sisters. The first contact of Islam in Africa was when Muslims needed refuge badly. We know that, right? Prophet ﷺ was thinking out of box. He's consulting Sahaba. And it did not, and they decided out of all the places in the world, that let's go to a place in Africa, Abyssinia, where there is a just king, Negus, or Najashi in Abyssinia, who is Christian. Let's go to that place, subhanallah. And this is the place that gave refuge to the believers for the first time. Some people say about 5 years later, about after the nubuwwah of the Prophet ﷺ. So 23 Muslims, went in the first round as refugees there. You're talking about refugees in Canada? Think about what kind of refuge they had to take for persecution of all sorts. And just imagine, the reason I put that map is this, look at the Mecca. Mecca is on top right there. They had to cross, they have to go down all the way south, cross, the Red Sea, the deadly waters. These are desert people. They don't even know how to, get on boats even. And they'll risk their lives to get to a place that was a land of refuge for them. And here is this Najashi, this just king who accepts them with open hearts and open minds. For years, we're talking about 20-something years, there were Sahaba living there. Almost 15 to 20 years almost, there were Sahaba living there. Including Ja'far ibn Abi Talib radiallahu ta'ala anhu, the first ambassador of Islam who went there as ambassador of believers. He's one of the last wave of people who came back to Medina to join the Prophet ﷺ at the time of Khaybar. So you have first round and the second round of 101 Muslims who took refuge at that time in this land. And this was our first physical contact with Africa. And most Muslims then came back, they made the second migration, Hijratain. This is the second migration, Hijratul Ukhra, that they made in the 7th year Hijri. So these are the three highlights from, African Islam I wanted to highlight from the time of Prophet ﷺ and Sahaba. So let's move on, inshallah, to something that is, inshallah, I hope to, inshallah, finish on time. So let's do this very quick. So without necessarily getting into too much nitty-gritty, I just want to do some highlights here of expansion of Islam in Africa. And as I get into this, I want to acknowledge a couple of great sources of, even though, let me say it this way. I want to acknowledge some great scholars of Islamic history. One of whom happened to be right here in Canada, of course, Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick, who was part of your series earlier. These are some authorities. Then scholars like Dr. Sherman Jackson, who is in the U.S., and then Dr. Okul Rashid. She is the head of, in the U.S., she's the head of the International Museum of, International Muslim Museum, which is in Jackson, Mississippi in the U.S. And I actually had the honor of interviewing her few times actually on something very particular that we'll talk about. So this is just simply a highlight that I wanted to share with you, how Islam actually entered Africa to begin with. How did it get in there? So yes, the first contact of Islam in Africa with Africa was what? Abyssinia, right? But it did not necessarily expand from there because most Muslims went back to Medina, to the Prophet ﷺ. So the first real African connection was, first gateway was through Egypt. During the time of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, in the year 20 years after Hijrah. And who was the famous Sahabi who conquered Egypt at the time? A great Sahabi, very well known. Amr bin al-As radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Okay? And this is why so many Egyptians we know have this name Amr. And there are other variations they love because this was the Sahabi who brought Islam officially to Egypt. And then in Libya, in the year 642, which is literally a year after that, Libya. So now Islam was expanding during the time of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, got into Tunisia after that, about 6 years later during the time of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Then it got into Algeria and Morocco. We're talking about now almost 30-something years later, in the time of Umayyads, basically. And then Muslims crossed over to the Strait of Gibraltar to Europe in the year 711. Why is this significant? Why is this so significant? This part. Anybody? Why is it significant that the Muslims were in the year 711? They actually crossed over to basically Strait of Gibraltar and hence to Europe, Spain. This was the first connection to Spain. So think about this. If there's no African Islam, if there's no Africa, we would not have that glorious civilization that everybody keeps talking about. 700 years of civilization and glory and peace and justice and whatnot. I mean, of course, it has its own history, has a lot of negative parts in there. There's a lot of ugly stuff that happened there as well. But that was the connection, is through Africa, through African Islam. So subhanAllah, think about that. And then during the time of Umar number two, Umar bin Abdul Aziz radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he was able to win over the indigenous Berber tribes of Africa, which were very difficult to actually win over. And then in the year, this is very significant, this is one of the reasons of expansion, real expansion of Islam, is in the year, in the 10th century. So we're talking about sort of mid 1900s, Al-Muravid, dynasty or movement, which basically came from Al-Murabitun. Al-Murabitun, very interesting history there, I don't have time to get into there. They actually ruled as a dynasty in Africa. They came out of West Africa and they ruled for about 100 years. And I'll get into it in just a moment. And then after that came another movement called Al-Muwahhidun, Al-Muwahhids in English. Al-Muwahhidun, they replaced Murabitun. Both were, by the way, very, very, considered to be very strict versions of Islam. And Africans did not like that. But they were very aggressive and they actually spread Islam. Even the African indigenous people just hated them because they were very, very, ultra strict people. And their methodology was really not very, in some ways was not even Islamic at times because they were very, very strict and rigid people. But this has to be mentioned because this was one of the reasons Islam spread in Africa. And then the glorious time of Africa, glorious era of African Islam is Mali, which we'll talk about in just a moment, between the year, in the 12th to 16th CE, so 400 years of Islam in Mali, in particular, Mali dynasty. So inshallah, let's move on. Okay, so before we get into this, yeah, you can actually do that. I just wanted to mention something very significant that, one more authority, very important authority that I forgot to mention in African Islam is Dr. Soleimani Niang from the US. Very significant. You can hear, he has, mashallah, a lot of incredible research on African Islam. He talks about a few reasons how Islamic spread. Unlike other parts of the world, African Islam is very unique, okay? And the way it spread over the years. So first of all, if anybody thinks Islam was spread with sword, especially in Africa, is absolutely false. Historically speaking, this just does not make sense, only because, first of all, one reason is that the Islamization of Africa and Arabization of Africa took centuries. If it was spread by the sword, it would have been literally within years that, literally one generation, you would have had everybody speaking Arabic. If not, at least everybody would have been Muslim. That's absolutely not true. So Africa, Islam did come to Africa through Egypt, through such conquests, but this is now actually spread. This is very, very interesting. So there are 3 or 4 major agencies of the spread of Islam in Africa. Number one is, of course, the initial contact of Islam through the Sahaba and the people who came and who basically discovered as Muslim explorers or Muslim military strategists who came and they got into Africa through Egypt and other places after that. But then there is the merchants, the tradesmen who brought Islam to Africa, which is really amazing. And the way it's interesting is that if you look at Africa, the map of Africa, you'll find that in the middle of it across, there's Sahara Desert. So Islam initially came to the north part of Africa, and it spread from Egypt all the way up to Morocco, Algeria, and went all the way to West Africa. But it did not make initially inroads into sub-Saharan desert and southern Africa. Okay? And one of the reasons was that it was very difficult to cross over. But what is amazing is, and even Africans themselves, even though they had camels that were introduced by Europeans at the time, they would not actually bring trade to southern parts of Africa. But it is Arab Muslims for the first time who knew how to take caravans in deserts. They actually brought merchants, they brought merchandise, they brought business to Africa, go back and forth. And what that did is, Arab Muslims were able to develop 4 or 5 unique, distinct, major trade routes within Africa, which was an incredible accomplishment. And what that did for Africa was that for the first time now, Africans were able to trade outside of Africa and export their stuff and import the stuff. So you're talking about China and Silk Road from China, and we're talking about spices from India were now coming not only to Africa, but now what else was happening? Anybody could think of what else was happening? So think about this. Above Africa, you have Mediterranean Sea. So now, during the time of Umayyads, Arab Muslims, Arab merchants, and Arab Muslims, and Arab military and Arab government at the time, Umayyad dynasty, was now in control of Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. What were they able to do now? They were able to control trade between what and what? Between Europe on that side and East, basically China, India, and all that. So for the first time, we also now have a naval force. Our first ever Muslim naval force in the sea was actually during time of Umayyads, thanks to their entrance into Africa. Without that, you would not have naval force even. Without that, you would not even have this kind of trade route, subhanAllah. So think about what Africa did for Islam, for Arabs, and for, of course, what Islam did for Africa, subhanAllah. So this was the second way Islam came to Africa, because through them came Muslims. Merchants came all the way in the depths of Africa. And through their character, they were able to spread Islam. And through them also came the preachers, da'is, who came and spread Islam. Third agency of the third way the Islam spread there, as I mentioned in the years starting mid 900s going up to 1100s, mid 1100s, you had these two movements, very, very aggressive movements, al-Murabitun and al-Muwahidun. If I had time, I would have gone a little bit into it. They both lasted about 100 years each almost, and that's it. And they actually, al-Muwahidun said, you're not strict enough, so let's kill all of you and get rid of you. And Muwahidun came. And they said, you're not actually practicing the real wahdani of the Prophet of Allah. So we are the true people of oneness of God. We're going to spread. So we are Muwahidun, and let's take you over. And they're the ones who also then went to Spain, and they caused some ruckus and chaos there as well. And they actually were fighting against the Umayyad, the second Umayyad dynasty, that they're the ones who established the famous Islam in Spain. They were actually aligning with Christians to fight the Umayyads there. So a lot of chaos there, okay? So this was the third agency. Fourth agency of the way Islam spread in Africa, believe it or not, was the Sufi orders there, especially in the southern African deserts. Sufi orders were very, very popular, and one reason was that they aligned really well with the indigenous African spiritual culture. They merged very well, and they were all about bringing people and bringing brotherhood and character building, which is something that actually Africans loved. And local Africans loved them, and Sufi orders spread Islam, especially in the south and some of the other parts, in West Africa. So, some of the greatest names, the famous names of Sufi tariqas actually come from Africa, nowhere else, interestingly. Tijaniya, Shazaliya, there's a whole bunch of others that actually come from Qadiriyya, named after Abdul Qadir Jilani, rahimahullah, even though he probably had nothing to do with it himself. But, they all came from African continent. And the fifth reason was, interestingly, and this is the last reason why I want to mention, because this is very unique, because nowhere else this happened, all these five things. And this is when Islam is spread in Africa, one of the ways it spread was that, when a Berber king accepted Islam, the whole tribe, everybody from their community would accept Islam. And Berber kings loved Islam at that time because Muslims were bringing money, merchandise. So initially they were opportunistic, but then they became genuine Muslims, and then community after community started becoming Muslims. So this is a very fascinating history of spread of Islam, which we don't hear about, because the only thing we hear about is Islam spread with what? With the sword, right? And maximum preaching. Yes, some preachers went, some Sahaba went, or Da'is went, and that's it. So let's remember that, inshallah. Let's move on very quickly. So so this is something I've already mentioned that, I've mentioned all that. Now, let me get into some very important highlight of African Islam. Sadly, we don't know much about this ourselves, and I'm including myself, okay? So, Mansa Musa, this is this is the man who made Africa what it became in terms of peak of African Islamic civilization, okay? Mansa Musa. Anybody knows about Mansa Musa? Anything at all? Yeah? Yep, he was the richest man on earth to have ever lived. He was the King of Mali, the Mali dynasty at the time. And Mali was just not this small country that we know today. It was actually a big dynasty, okay? And this man, may Allah have mercy on him, he was the king of Mali from the late 13th century, meaning late 1200s. And the reason why it is known to be richest, if you look at his net worth, $400 billion. If you look at the richest people that live today, Bill Gates, who else is one of the richest people? Well, please don't mention that name. Who else is one of the richest people? Subhanallah. Warren Buffett. Who else? The whole bunch, right? If you put their net worth together, it does not add up to what he actually had. And this is not Muslim saying this, by the way. This is according to non-Muslim, mainstream non-Muslim historical records, that his net worth was incredibly high, as high as $400 billion. He made fortune essentially through selling salt and gold, which was found in Mali, okay? Or in the region of Mali, or West Africa in general. He built some of the most sophisticated urban cities in which it had palaces, masajid, libraries. He brought architects from Spain and Cairo to build those beautiful cities. So now think about this. I want you to picture this. All we know about Islam's civilization, the great glory of Islam is what, usually? Spain, right? What people don't realize, that the real glory of Spain, or Islamic Spain, was really for the first 200, 300 centuries. Even though, yes, we claim we were there, alhamdulillah, until we finally got kicked out, we were there for 700 years. But real glory was not more than 200 something years, really, 200, maximum 300, when they got divided up in Ta'ifa cities, literally groups upon groups. Every city was fighting each other. Every island was fighting each other, okay? So yes, it was glory. There was glory, but it's not as glorious as sometimes is depicted. There was amazing stuff that came out of it, incredible civilization that came out of it that Europe took advantage of. But this is we're talking about 200 years after that. This is what Africa gave rise to. Think about this. Basically all independently on its own. But this man, one of the greatest names was this Mansa Musa, this king. And he built one of the most advanced cities in the world at the time, which again we don't really usually know about. Now what is significant, one of the reasons why he's most known for, one of the most things that he's most known for is his pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina that he did. Historic pilgrimage. If you read about it, it's really, really amazing. Some historians say there's a lot of exaggeration. And there may be, okay? But the bottom line is, what he did and the effect of his pilgrimage is unheard of and unprecedented. So what he did was, he took this, think about this today. He went with his entourage of hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of people with him that went with him, each carrying several pounds of gold. Now there's a debate how many pounds of gold, each one of them. He financed everybody's Umrah or Hajj. Think about this. Today, if somebody tells you, I'm going to sponsor your Hajj, how happy you would be. But not only that, but he literally gives everybody gold to carry with them. Not only for themselves, but most importantly, for others on the way. So there are historical documented cases where he went, as they were passing cities upon cities, they were giving away gold, okay? All across Africa, and especially when they went to Mecca and Medina. So they were giving away gold in Alexandria. This is documented in Egypt. In Cairo, whatever other places you can think of, there was gold given in those places. Literally out of generosity, no other reason, okay? And then they went to Mecca and Medina. And in Mecca and Medina, they gave away tons of gold, okay? Now, what's so significant about this? What's the big deal? Anybody think of any big deal? What happened as a result? When he comes back, what happens? Think about what happened to the economy. Yeah, anybody? Inflation. Now everybody has money. A gold sitting in there for 10 years. This is a non-Muslim historian talking about that for 10 years there was a dip in the not only price of gold, and historically no one man ever in history was able to control the price of gold the way he did. And it was not necessarily intentional, just because this is what he just did. And the impact of it was felt for 10 years. The economies were affected because of what he did. So just imagine how incredibly rich this, and not just rich, there are lots of rich people out there, lots of Muslim rich people. But what's important is what he did. Think about this. So is this the image that you ever see or you ever think of African Islam and African Muslims? Highly civilized, extremely rich, luxurious, person who's floating and living in luxury all his life. He is actually giving away gold. Unbelievable. Okay? So now this takes me to a very, very important part of history. This is one of the most incredible, one of the most prolific aspects of African Islam. If we miss this, we miss everything. Okay, this is the fruit. These are the fruits of the civilization, African Islamic civilization that we saw, and it's part of Mansa Musa's contribution. Okay, so Mansa Musa built several universities. One of them was Sankore University, which is still there today. Sankore University in Mali, still there in Timbuktu, the famous city, historic city that brother mentioned earlier, Timbuktu. Okay, I just wanted to keep track of time. So in Timbuktu was one of the earliest universities ever found globally. It is said there were more international students studying there, Muslims and non-Muslims, at Sankore University, and there's a masjid attached to it, by the way, that were studying there, than number of international students found in New York, a city like New York. Think about that. This is how rich literacy-wise and scholarly, in terms of scholarly caliber, how rich this city was, or this place was, both from Islamic studies perspective as well as secular perspective. Now, and so what I'm trying to really get at is what actually happened in about 10 years ago. Okay, and Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick talks about this. He was being part of some of this himself. There was a major historic event that took place. And this is where I was talking about Dr. Okul Rashid, who is the head of the International Islamic Museum that is she founded herself in Jackson, Mississippi. Pretty much the only Islamic museum in North America, okay? So, I interviewed her several times because of this. This was about 10 years ago. There was a group of 25 or so historians as well as sociologists, anthropologists who went down to West Africa and Mali in particular to dig up, and they found out that there were some scrolls there that were found. Okay, historic scrolls. We're talking about books, literally books found there. So as they start excavating, they couldn't believe that they found, over 1 million scrolls just in the city of Mali itself. 1 million books. Think about this. If you were to dig up Scarborough today, you find 1 million books. This would change the history of the whole nation or whole city. What would it tell you? That books that were buried for 500 years, and if they all of a sudden found, what would it tell you about what happened 100 years ago? What would it tell you about that? Highly literate, highly civilized, unlike what we hear about Africa today, right? And there were 20 million more books found in the rest of West Africa. Subhanallah. 20 million books, scrolls, historic scrolls. What is very significant is that 85% of these books were written in Arabic. Subhanallah. These people were so close to Islam that they wrote books on astronomy, to embryology, you name anything, they wrote about it. Okay? They wrote about something that nobody had heard of up until not that long ago, a few hundred years ago, a few decades ago, the concept of peacekeeping. Canada is known to be a global peacekeeping country. In fact, Canada is pioneer. They actually had models defined in those books in Arabic and of course African languages that these people had already talked about and thought. They have fuqaha, they had books on tajweed, aqidah, fiqh, you name it, they were there. And they had books on astronomy, you name any book, that was actually, and that is still being excavated. It's only 10 years ago they found it. They're still excavating. And sadly, thanks to a lot of the extremists who were actually killing people recently in Mali, subhanallah, we have lost some of that, quite a bit of that actually. This legacy of illiterate Islam that was being protected is actually, they've tried burning all this stuff. They said, we don't want any of this history of Islam. So it was very, very sad reality. There were Muslims who were protecting all this, even non-Muslims were trying to protect this legacy. So this is very, very significant. And as Ibn Battuta talks about this, and other historians talks about this. Ibn Battuta, by the way, is another reason why Africa is very well known and Muslims in Africa are known, is because Ibn Battuta was from Morocco, and he was one of the most famous Muslim historians ever, explorers and historians ever. So he talks about that, and others talk about that, if you went to Mali in those days, and West Africa in those days, guess what was the most profitable business ever in those days? Sorry. What was the most profitable business? It's already there. Book publishing. Subhanallah, book publishing. That tells you how big these people were in terms of literacy and education. There were people who were just simply dedicated to scribing and writing. There were people and literally companies that were dedicated to simply decorating the books. This was an art that they mastered that nobody else was doing at that time. Literally, books were decorated, beautified, and with all sorts of ornaments. They actually specialized in that. And all of that was lost for 500 years, and now all of a sudden they started finding all this. Subhanallah. So think about this. And I already mentioned this, that these historians and archaeologists who went there, 25 of them, they said that this is the greatest discovery ever when it comes to of any manuscripts after the Dead Sea Scrolls ever. Okay, and it is said, as Dr. Ogul Rashid talked about, that these people, when they went there and they saw these scrolls and these books, they were in tears. They said that, subhanallah, finally, and they were not Muslims. They said, finally, we find that link to Islam and literacy, education, civilization that was literally buried underground for all these centuries. Okay? It changed the world. This discovery changed the way we see the world, especially by the academics, the academia, people who are in universities, who are spreading all sorts of nonsense and misinformation about Africans and African Islam. And in the Western and Muslim world, how they viewed about Africa itself. It is an evidence of an extremely literate civilization, an immensely rich Islamic scholarly tradition, and it is, as they say, that this is the missing link between Africa, African Americans, and the African American Muslims and North Americans. Because guess what? People who were stolen from their lands by the colonialists, by the Americans, now as known as we know today, were from 30% of them were actually from Muslim lands. They come from this heritage, but this was stolen and stripped away from them. And I'll just actually be ending my, inshallah, I think I have 2 more slides to go, inshallah, with that. And I want to now transition into to North American Islam, African Islam in America. As I mentioned earlier, brothers and sisters, 1/3 of Islam in America today is what? It's African Muslims. And they're highly neglected. You go to conferences, how many of African Muslims do you see? A fourth, as I mentioned, 1/4 of Islam right here in Toronto is African Muslims, Somalis in general, right? So think about this, 15 to 30%, it's very hard to pinpoint, but they say 15 to 30% Africans who were enslaved and brought by the colonial US were Muslims from the coastal and interior regions of Islamic empires of Songhai, Ghana, and Mali. Many came. Now this is very significant. This is why African scholars now today say, and Muslim scholars in particular say, never ever say African American slaves. They were not African Muslim slaves or African American slaves. They were not slaves. These people were living a free life, much more freer at times than we are today, and much luxurious and elite lifestyle, and more religious lifestyle even at times than we are living today in Africa at that time. Some of them were princes, okay? They were stolen from their lands. Some of them were Hafiz al-Quran. They were ulama. There was, some of them, and I'll mention just a couple of them, were doctors and they're Hafiz at the same time. Subhanallah. And they had everything going for them until somebody came and stole them from their lands, stole them and brutally, murdered them, burned them alive, and did horrific things with them that completely changed the way we look at that civilization today. They were dehumanized. And this is why we see African Islam and African Americans, the way we see today. African Americans the way we see today. When was the last time you saw an African American, forget about African American Muslim, when was the last time you saw an African American Muslim, African American being interviewed on TV on an intellectual topic for some analysis? When was the last time? When was the last time you saw an African American invited to, let's say to a university to give a speech? I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but when was the last time you saw somebody on TV or somewhere else? Because this is not how they're supposed to be viewed. What are 3 things or 2 things that African Americans, forget about African American Muslims, are known for that they could do best, and that's it? What are the couple of professions that they should be doing, and that's it? What are those? Basketball. So athletes, they can be great athletes. And what else? You can be great singers. What did you say? Somebody said entertainers. Entertainers. They could be great entertainers, but nothing else. Okay, because you're not intellectual enough to do any of these things. What we don't know is that there are more African PhDs today in America, African American PhDs than there are basketball players. Okay, but yet you never see them, hardly see on TV. Okay, so this is part of the systematic racism that Muslims have also internalized. And this is why this is so significant and so important for us to know. So, Ayyuba bin Solomon Jallo, in the early 1700s, was a well-mannered, intelligent, literate trader and imam at the same time. Bilali Muhammad, or Bin Ali as he became to be known as in America, was an African scholar in the early 1800s. And Muhammad Ali bin Said, also known as Nicholas Said, had medical training and knew 9 languages. How many of us know more than 3 languages here? How many of us know 3 languages? Just imagine how intellectually capable you have to be and smart you have to be to know 9 languages. This guy was a doctor and also a person who knew 9 languages. Incredible, right? So these are just some examples that we know of. Most of it we don't even know of. There's so much lost history there. Okay? So, quick facts about early African Islam that we need to know. Number 1, the first person to request the freedom of all slaves in America was a Muslim. Okay? Muslims fought in many early battles, including some of the names that I mentioned. They actually were part of the military, willingly went into those wars, and they actually participated, and they're part of civic engagement and civic duty even at that time, despite being literally enslaved by their masters. Muslims were known to live in at least 7 of the 13 original colonies. Until this day, there are those African Muslims and Africans in general who trace in those colonies, like North Carolina and many other places, they actually trace their ancestry back to those people who were who were enslaved and brought here from Africa and from Islamic parts of Africa. And many of them, of course, are no longer Muslims. Their lineage is gone and they have no connection to Islam. They say, yes, our ancestors were Muslims, unfortunately. Early American Muslims have contributed many Arabic words that are either contributed or they popularized Arabic words that are now found in English language. Some of them include admiral, algebra, of course, atlas, banana, cable. Anybody knows where the word cable comes from in Arabic? Habl, hablun warid, or hablullah, right? Habl. Camel, where does that come from? Camel. Jamal, exactly. Checkmate, coffee, qahwa, of course. Cotton, rice from, jasmine, lemon from laymoon, magazine, mask, rice, ruz, sofa, sugar from sukkar, syrup, and zero, of course, from sifar. Okay, these are some of the words that actually were Arabic. African Muslims popularized these words and made it, due to which it became very popular in English language. And we also need to know, as Dr. Abdullah Hakim Cook talks about all the time, that before Columbus, in 1986, there were Moors, basically from North Africa, again we're talking about African Islam, who crossed the Atlantic Ocean in ships to the New World, and there are documented cases of that. So let's remember that. So let's end, inshallah, with some credits that are due, really. And this is just highlights of it, okay? Of African Islam to African Islam today, without whom we would be nowhere. Without whom we would be nobody, subhanAllah, if you think about their contributions. And I'll mention that we need to, before I even get into some of these names, let me mention one thing. We as Muslims, whether Sunni Muslims or if there are Shias out there, even Shia Muslims right here in Canada or North America, we need to understand and appreciate that, before the mainstream Sunni Islam that we know today came a version of Islam that I'm sure none of us affiliate ourselves with, but we need to appreciate what they did for Islam in Africa. And those are the people of Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad and Fard Muhammad and whatnot. And we know they were, from our perspective, they were, of course, not on the right guidance, very contrary to our belief system. But what they did for Islam in Africa is something that is unparalleled. They are the ones who first popularized Islam in America in one way or the other, especially among African Muslims. Not so much necessarily among the white American Muslims, but among African Muslims. And yes, we do not agree with their version of Islam. It's absolutely something that we cannot accept as theology. But we have to appreciate that they have an incredible contribution. They have done an incredible job. And from whom came what? Who? This man, rahimahullah, Al-Hajj, Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, rahimahullah, right? Through them is eventually, this is the man who came. And this is the man in a matter of 9 months of accepted Islam, revolutionized Islam in America. And without whom today, I don't think we would be here today. I'm not saying that we wouldn't be here necessarily physically, but our Islam wouldn't be at the level where it is today because of the sacrifices of great people like him and African Americans in general, and especially African Muslims, but African Americans in general, who gave their lives for the civic liberties that you and I enjoy in Canada and North America, and America and Canada. So we owe it to them. We have to think about that. We owe it to them despite the fact that we may disagree with them. But there are some names that I want to mention, and some faces, and many are not there that should have been there. Maybe if I update my slide next time, I'll include some of these names and faces. These are the people who, more than any of us today, they represent Islam in different facets of life to America, to Canada even, in many, many ways. Okay? So if you think about some of the greatest scholars out there, well-known scholars, and preachers, and leaders out there, entertainers even, writers, they happen to be African Muslims, and we are at times neglecting them, and the only time we go to them is when we need them for a conference because they're a big name, right? But think about some of the faces here. I'll start off with Sister Tayyiba Taylor, who passed away barely 2 years ago. May Allah have mercy on her. She's originally Canadian, by the way, from Ottawa. She lived in the US. She established first and one of the only actually Muslim Sisters magazine that is highly professional, high quality magazine that still runs professionally, Aziza magazine. Okay, so she's the one who's the founder, and she just passed away 2 years ago, actually a year and a half ago. May Allah have mercy on her as a result of cancer. Then you have Nadiruddin, very famous, very popular Islamic Nasheed group that has popularized Islamic Nasheeds in America. They're one of the great people. Hip hop is, music or hip hop Nasheeds, whatever you want to call it. They are the leaders in this. And then, of course, we have great scholars from Imam Siraj Wahaj to Imam Zaid Shakir. Then you have Keith Allison, who is representing in the Congress in the U.S. And then, of course, we have Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, may Allah have mercy on him and protect him, the famous boxer, the champ. And then, of course, we have Sheikh Abdullah Idris here. We have Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick here. Many, many scholars. Dr. Abdul Hakim Jackson in the U.S. So many names we can think of and we can mention. But we owe our Islam at least partly to these great scholars and great leaders who are representing Islam in mainstream for us. So let me end with this. African Muslims in particular, and we all, need to be proud of this legacy of literacy and civilization. We need to, I hope, remember and learn that Africa is a land of beauty, of beautiful people, of literate people, not savages, not just criminals and the poor that we know of all the time and hear about all the time. Muslims must reconnect with their African Islamic heritage. And Muslims must rethink attitudes toward Africa and African Islam and African Muslims. And Muslims must fight racism to be more inclusive. If this presentation does not help us with the last point or the last 2 points, honestly, we have lost the point. We have lost the whole point of this presentation. We need to fight racism within. We have racism against African Muslims in particular, but even among ourselves, even Indian subcontinent people have racism. People who are among Arabs, they have racism, and Arab versus South Asians, and South Asians versus Arabs, and versus South Asians versus Africans. We have that racism sadly ingrained in our own communities. And this is the test. These are the few litmus tests of your racism, okay? Or of your inclusiveness. The ayah that I started off with. Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha, wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila lita'arafu, inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. That, if this doesn't help us, then we have lost the whole point. Ask yourself, if somebody comes to you, an African brother or even African sister, comes to you asking for the hand of your son or daughter. You are not from African heritage, and what would be your reaction? It's understandable that people want to marry within their own language, within their communities. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with preferences. But it's another to fight it because of your ingrained racism. Think about that. Ask yourself. Ask yourself when you hire people, whether recruiting volunteers or hiring in a company, whatever it may be. When was the last time you actually preferred an African Muslim, not just for the sake of it, but because they are capable. They have equal opportunity just like you, and in fact, you should be more open to other ethnic communities simply because we need diversity in all our organizations, in our communities, in our masajid, in our businesses. And when was the last time you brought people to leadership level, right, in that capacity? And what about scholarship? How many of us do truly consider African imams as our imams and scholars? Or do we just go to our own imams and our own sheikhs? Like, I'm just asking these questions for us to think about, that's all. It's up to us, at the end of the day, how we behave. It's up to us how we react. But we can change what's in here, and we will inshallah change it when we appreciate what African Islam and African Muslims have done for Islam and Muslims. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If you have any questions, well, here's my contact in case anybody wants to get in touch. But if you have any comments, questions, corrections, please do so. Jazakallah khair. Go ahead, brother.
It's an honor for us to have you and what we learn about Africa. I am sure that most of us have not known that things which you brought up from this and they were the richest people, they were the pioneer of Islam, they were the scholars, and they were everything. But what is the reason of they have been neglected now, or they have come down to that stage where nobody give them a part?
Very good question. So what is the reason why African Islam and African Muslims have been treated this way? To be honest, the reason is, there are two reasons. One is that, as they say, out of sight, out of mind. When you do not see people living among you, I'm talking about earlier, starting early on, okay? So when, Islam, the center of Islam was what? Arabia, right? And then it spread all over the world. Africa was always known to be a dark continent, not because of color of the skin, which is another reason, but also because they said that nobody would ever penetrate. It's such a huge land, and especially the sub-Saharan, the Sahara Desert was one of the issues why many people, explorers even, were unable to penetrate. So my point is that when you don't go there, you don't see people from Africa, and you do not interact with people, of course you're going to naturally neglect them, even unintentionally. So this is one reason. Like, if you're talking about not just Muslims treating them this way, we're talking about throughout history, Africans in general were mistreated or neglected in general because of that's one reason. And second reason is very simple and very, very basic, and that is, and we have to acknowledge it, is color of the skin. Muslims or non-Muslims, human beings in general, we are sadly, we have this very artificial perception of attraction and beauty. So if somebody happens to be African or black or looks this way or that way, for some people, not everybody, for some people it is actually something that, is not like me. So if he is not like me, I don't need to actually care about that person. I don't need to worry about that person. Or in fact, I will actually treat that person very inferior to me. So this is very sadly, and this is why what the Prophet ﷺ said, right? So many times. He talked about this. He knew it at that time. There was racism during the time of Prophet ﷺ. There were racism, if I remember correctly, Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu ta'ala anhu himself faced racism among some of the newer people who came to Islam. And they said, look at this African, right? So think about that. This was there. This is a reality, and we have to accept it. It is there today. Ask yourself, brother, and ask yourself, sisters and brothers and sisters, and I'll ask myself, whatever language you speak, Urdu, Bengali, Swahili, whatever, well, not Swahili, non-African languages, Urdu, English even, what are the words that are used to mention and, refer to people of African descent who look black, let's say? What are the words in our languages? Are they very praiseworthy words? Highly derogatory, highly demeaning, very sick words that are used. So not only in English language, the sad words that are so derogatory, demeaning, the N words, but there are words in our own languages that are out there that we use. We have to stop that. That's what I was saying. If this is one thing we have to take is how we use our language, how we treat other people, especially people of African descent, inshallah. Any other quick questions? I'm sure you have salah time now. Yes. Okay, inshallah. Brother, go ahead. Yes, brother.
Why did Mali fall? Like, politically, it was such a powerful empire. Why did it just fall?
Good question. Why did Mali fall? And I would not claim to be an expert on African history in general, but one thing I'll say is that one of the reasons they say, it's not specifically about this only, but I'm saying in general about dynasties that fall and that have fallen across, is the fact that in Africa in particular, but everywhere, there were always these new movements and new dynasties, hunger and power. This is the bottom line. Who would just pop up from nowhere, and they would believe that we are the best and we can rule better. With that comes money. With land comes money, all the power basically, right? So this is one reason. Another reason, if you read historically, if you read actually Umayyad dynasty and read Abbasid dynasty, okay? You don't have to go far down further down in the history. You'll find that most dynasties did not rule more than 100 to 200 years, okay? Most of them. And same with Mali. Actually, it's pretty long that they actually were able to, they at one time, they had 400 cities under them. Think about this. So this is very significant, mashallah, that they actually were there for that long. But there was so much infighting happening even during the time of Abbasids, that there were like literally 4 or 5 Khalifas everywhere. Like at one time there were 4 or 5 people claiming to be Khalifas all over, despite the fact that Abbasids were known to be Khalifas. There were Fatimids there, and again in Africa, Fatimids who were the original Ismailis, So there's a whole bunch of these. So like they were swept one after another basically for one reason or the other. Yeah, so I don't know specific reason why they were swept, but this is just a cycle, right? This is the sunnah of Allah, as they say basically. Power goes up, power goes down. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq to learn from this, and if there's anything wrong in it, may Allah forgive us, and if there's any good, inshallah, may Allah accept it and put barakah and help us practice. Ameen.
Ameen. Jazakallah khair, Brother Taha. So inshallah we'll break for Maghrib Salah right now. If I can request the first 3 rows here of chairs, if you can just fold these chairs up and keep them to the side so we can use the space for